Hey everybody, welcome to Pop Culture Philosophers. I'm Rockin' Robbie Billups. Today it's time for a Comics Revisited. In fact, it's the end of Season 1 of Comics Revisited, so we're doing something monumental. We're going to be talking about one of the most important comic books ever, Maus. That's right, everybody. Welcome to Pop Culture Philosophers and Comics Revisited. It's time to wrap up Season 1 with one of the most important comic books ever, and it's Maus, right here by Art Spiegelman. This comic book is basically about his father's experience in the Holocaust, but I would dare to say that this book is not so much about a survivor's experience throughout the Holocaust as much as it is about a son dealing with his father's memory of his experience through World War II as a Polish Jewish person. Absolutely. I'm Rockin' Robbie Billups. This is
Brian Weaver.
And we are here to talk about Maus. Seriously, one of the most important comic books ever made, in my opinion. Probably in Brian's opinion.
Yes.
That's why you're here?
Yeah.
Absolutely. The only comic book to ever win the Pulitzer Prize. It won it in 1992. It is written and illustrated by Art Spiegelman, whose father, Vladek, lived through the Holocaust. Him and his wife, Anya, were in Auschwitz. They went through all these terrible, trying times. But it's more about the relationship between this father and the son that don't really quite, and even in the very beginning, Spiegelman lets us know that he never had the best relationship with his father. And this kind of helped him understand his father a little bit more. It helps us understand his father and his generation a little bit more. And it also just helps, it's about so much. I love this book so much. So it was, first of all, published in Raw magazine, which was an avant-garde indie comic book strip. Art Spiegelman was a big deal as far as underground comic books go in the 70s, especially subversive, violent, all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, things like that, right? And he wanted to tackle something real. He wanted to do a long-form comic book that was about something meaningful. So he started interviewing his father about his experience in World War II because he, like I said, he was in the concentration camp. He had to deal with all this stuff, right? And he learns a lot about it. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992 after the whole thing was wrapped up and completed. It made a big deal. It was very important in helping comic books grow up and helping the mainstream audience accept comic books as a legitimate form of artistic expression. And I absolutely love this comic book. I love it so much. Overall, what do you think about this comic book?
Well, I agree. It's one of the most important comics I've ever read. There's definitely several scenes that happen that, like, I'll never forget. Like, I mean, I've read thousands of comics by this point, and I couldn't tell you what happened in, 90% of them. But there are several moments in this that, I can't forget. Yeah. And yeah, like I said, I mean, the importance of it just really can't be understated. I mean, in the 80s, when the first volume came out, which collected the first 6 chapters, I want to say. That it got a lot of traction that way because I wouldn't say like a bunch of people were probably reading Raw magazine.
Yeah, right.
And
Spiegelman never intended it to be like something that was going to be seen or read by the majority of literary specialists and stuff like that. It never even crossed his mind that was going to happen. Right.
But that release there, though, it caught enough traction that I'm fairly certain he got a grant that allowed him to finish the remaining chapters, that then completed the story in volume 2.
Yeah.
So, because I mean, how impactful that first one was is he hadn't even made it into the concentration camps, and it was still.
I know. Book 1 ends on such a down note. Yeah. People talk about Empire ending on a down note. No, Maus Volume 1 ends on a down note because it's when his parents wind up in Auschwitz. Yeah.
And that's another thing, like, in D.C. they have the Holocaust Museum, and I've been to it several times, and one of my main memories of going there the very first time is I walk in and they have a replica of the gates of Auschwitz, which has the Arbeit macht frei, which is work and you'll be free. They're giving them the illusion that you walk in here, if you behave or whatever, you'll actually get to walk out. And, it's like, that keyed me when I was in there. I was like, wow, I mean, that's, it's really powerful stuff.
Very, very, very powerful. So the basic story, like we said, is more so about his father's experience during World War II, but it also does capture a lot about his mother. His mother committed suicide when he was 20 years old, so a lot of it is also about him and his father kind of dealing with that. You know, his father has remarried, but it's not a happy marriage. It's very divisive, you know. Yeah. He thinks that his new wife, is it Mala?
Mala,
right? Yeah, is all about the money and this and that, but it's also because this is someone who was haunted by his past. And it's something that's very hard for those of us who haven't had that kind of a traumatic experience in our past to understand how that can affect us. And it's something that Art struggles with in the book. And so, yeah, it's very simply put, it's a story about Jewish survivors throughout the Holocaust. And, you know, the Jewish people are portrayed as mice. The Nazis are portrayed as cats. The Polish people are pigs. The French are frogs. The Americans are dogs. And it's all just a metaphor. But even the metaphor breaks down intentionally throughout the whole thing. And there's so much about that. But it's also just about how the father's history, how the family's history, how history itself can, just like in the Bible when they say, this shall be a curse upon your family for like 4 generations. That's really how the past is. Terrible traumatic experiences that happen to one man or woman may carry on into future generations of their family. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, how we are today is how we treat other people. You know, I mean, that just keeps repeating. And I mean, and specifically these types of events are so traumatic. And, you know, I mean, there's, you know, it's going to have lifelong effects. And those are, you know, there's a lot of peculiarities in Vladic's, you know, character and like mannerisms and things that he does, but you can see that they're directly related to his experience. And he obviously raised his, you know, his son this way. Yeah. You know, and so, I mean, yeah.
Absolutely. It's also about his and his father's relationship with his mother, Anya, and the fact that she committed suicide after surviving such an ordeal like this, right? Yeah. And it doesn't really delve so much into it because it delves into it as much as Art allows himself to delve into it, right? He states in interviews, even as recently as a couple years ago that I watched, that he doesn't even remember his life and how like that point when his mother committed suicide, that he just kind of, like, one of the reasons why he did that short little comic book that they put in the MAUS is because he was trying to like revisit it and reflect on it a little bit because he never thought about it. He pushed it away. And that is part of his father's character that comes to him, and it's part of a lot of survivors' character and a lot of people that feel like the best way to deal with, for lack of a better term, the shit that happens in the world is to ignore it, to push it down and keep going and learn the lesson and keep moving. And I feel like in the comic book, his father kind of really, I think Art and Vladic are very similar. As much as they like clash against each other and that relationship doesn't quite compare, like doesn't quite mesh up while his father's alive, I feel like Art learned a lot more about his father after his death, because his father died in, what was it, 1980 something, but it was before the book even like really got the acclaim or was even published, right? Yeah. And I think maybe they had started publishing it or something like that. And the end of his father's life is actually in the book. We're not going to spoil too much for it, but just look up a history book. You'll see what happens. But obviously they make it through. They have their own son. So it's also about Art Spiegelman's struggle to tell this story. Yep. Which I think is one of the best things. Because, yeah, it could easily just be a story about Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And you could have the cat and mouse metaphor there. But that wouldn't make it as important and as impactful as it actually is, aside from the fact that like half the book is about Art Spiegelman's struggle with his father and to even tell the story. The guilt that he feels weighing on him, that he's making money off of his family's misery. He's making money off of a people's misery, right? And that really comes across very heavy-handed in this book, but so delicately as well. That I absolutely think it's amazing. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, the way those things come across, where he's you know, that scene, there's that scene where you know, he's like we were talking earlier, where he's like, you know, drawing over the dead bodies, and then like they're talking, the press starts pressing in on him because this is after the first volumes come out, and he just his art, drawn himself, he just keeps getting smaller and smaller until he's basically a baby and throws a tantrum and all that stuff. It was
and he's at his drawing table on top of all these bodies of victims of the Jewish Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
And like you were saying, the press is, and he feels surrounded by the fame and the guilt over that he's making money and he's making a name for himself off of this terrible tragedy, which a lot of people at the time kind of like renounced him for.
Yeah.
And they thought that maybe he was like, well, they're all cartoon characters. It's a comic book. There's been so much covered about the history of the Holocaust. Do we need another Holocaust story in the 80s? I mean, it was something that was heavily covered, right?
Yeah. But to me, that's what separates this is it is largely about his relationship, with his father and, dealing with all that grief and guilt. And I mean, one of the things where you were talking about earlier, where you stamp the grief down and the trauma down. The reason, the point in the story where he reprinted that Prisoner on Hell Planet sketch was because his father found it, and it was like 10 years after it had been published. He found it, read it, but they never actually talked about it directly.
Do you know, when you read the book and you put the timeline together, it's not that far off from his mother's suicide.
It isn't.
When he started making this book.
No.
And that's why, like, The Prisoner on Hell Planet is like a 4-page short story he did, kind of about his view on his mother's suicide and how he wasn't so attached to it. I love in that strip how he slowly becomes a prisoner.
Yeah.
Right? And I just think it's so subtle.
Clothes change and everything like that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a completely different style, so when it shows up in the book, it's just very stark.
Yeah,
it's
very
a big
jarring.
contrast. Yeah, very jarring, very jarring. So that brings us into the animal metaphor. Part of the style of the book is that Art Spiegelman decided to portray the Jewish people as mice, the Polish people as pigs, which a lot of people have problems with these metaphors because they think it helps dehumanize racism, right? And that the Nazis viewed the Jewish people as a completely different species of creature, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But what he's really trying to do, to me, is first of all, there's a quote that's in the book. It's at the beginning in my version, which is both of them together in one hardcover. There's a point in here. It's right before book 2 starts, where there's a quote from a Nazi.
It's Nazi propaganda material.
Yeah, it's Nazi propaganda. And he basically says something to the effect, here it is. Mickey Mouse is the most miserable idea ever revealed. Healthy emotions tell every independent young man and every honorable youth that the dirty and filth-covered vermin, the greatest bacteria carrier in the animal kingdom, cannot be the ideal type of animal. Away with Jewish brutality. Yeah, I'm not even going to keep on. But basically the idea that Mickey Mouse is helping perpetrate this idea that even the vermin, even the lowly people in society can have emotions, can be people, can be well-rounded. And so I think he chose the Mickey Mouse idea, the cartoon character idea, to portray this. First of all, the Nazis refer to the Jewish people as vermin all the time. Yeah. So he's showing that. He's showing also the absurdity of the idea that they're so different, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the quotes, I don't remember exactly who said it, but it was a Nazi who said, and it might have been Hitler, but said that the Jews are definitely a race, not a human, but they're not human. So I mean, it's like completely taking them out of that.
Yeah. So and also like that they're mice and they're pigs and they're cats, but they still are very humanoid, right?
Yes.
And so Art Spiegelman, in an interview that I recently watched, even said that one of the things is they're vermin, right? They're mouse. Yeah, sure. If you want to call us vermin, you want to call us mice, that's fine. That's what we are. But these mice stand up on their own 2 legs and demand that you accept them as human.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And as the story goes on, he starts deconstructing that metaphor. And he deals with the problems of it in the book. So any criticism anybody I've ever read that they had on the animal metaphor, right? Maybe it's too dehumanizing or maybe it's too silly or anything like that. Like, that is something that Spiegelman himself is expressing in the art itself. Yeah. Like, towards the end, like when he's talking to his therapist, they're both wearing mice masks.
Yeah.
And in interviews, Spiegelman even says, I don't view them as mice, but wearing mice masks, like mouse masks.
Yeah.
Right? And the absurdity of telling something so important, so big, such a big deal, like the Holocaust, right? An attempt to eradicate a whole race of people, right? something so heavy, so huge, but to tell it, first of all, in a comic book, it's absurd. To tell it with cartoon characters, it's absurd. He's playing up to that. He's subverting that image of a comic book cartoon character by doing something real, doing something meaningful, doing something impactful, and something lasting. At least that's what I think about it. What do you think more about the metaphor and why he chose to do it that way?
Yeah, yeah. When I first read these, you have that quote in there that, to me, helped solidify why he chose mice to begin with. And the using the animal metaphor. A lot of it made sense to me the way he did it. And quite frankly, you can still feel the horror of all of these things going through there, even though it's the heads that are representative of the animals. I mean, they're all represented as people, but they've got animal heads, and everything like that. So that, like you were saying, they are still standing on their 2 feet, and everything. But to me, I thought the metaphor was pretty powerful because it gives you these the differences between the different groups of characters, or the different groups of people. When you're telling stories this big, you are somewhat generalizing, with some of these things. So, it made it also clearly identifiable, who is what, in these things.
He even talks about in the book how it's an almost impossible task for him to cover this. Mm-hmm. He's like, I can't, the limitations of the comic book won't let me tell this story the way I feel like it needs to be told. But in hindsight, I really think that Spiegelman did a fantastic job.
Oh yeah.
And Spiegelman also was very important. Apparently, he did Garbage Pail Kids, which I didn't know.
I did not know that.
Until watching this interview with Neil Gaiman. But he did a lot of covers for the New Yorker, which were very controversial at their times. Mm-hmm. He did the famous 9/11 cover. That's the black towers on a black background.
Yeah.
Very, very artistically impactful, and his art in Maus is way different than some of the other things. One of the techniques that he used is usually comic books, they're done a lot bigger than the actual product that we get. It's because they can do the image on 11 by 18, something like that, right?
Yeah.
They do all this detailed image, they shrink it down, it hides a lot of the imperfections.
Yeah.
It hides a lot of the stuff, the discrepancies and stuff that doesn't work, right? He did Maus on pages the actual size of the book. That's why every book that's ever been reprinted, you don't have an oversized copy of Maus, because this is the size of the pages that he drew it on, right? And it makes it feel raw. It makes it feel rough. It doesn't hide anything about any negative aspects of the artwork if you could find them, right? Because not everything is pitch perfect, but it's highly textured, very detailed. Another thing that he uses as a style motive, style preference in here is that because the book goes from Art talking to his father to his father's story fluidly, back and forth, and sometimes non-linearly, right?
Correct. Oh, yeah.
And all the stuff that's present day, at least of the time, is a very rigid 8-panel grid for the most part. But when you get into Vladic's flashbacks, the page composition gets a little bit more experimental. He gets a little bit more free and loose with it. And like you were pointing out before we came on air, it gets darker.
Oh, yeah.
Heavier blacks, more claustrophobic. Really capturing that feel to me. What do you think about his artistic style and what he chose to do?
Oh, yeah. I agree with all that. Because it was the animals and the cartoony kind of stuff, it's going to seem very simple at first. But to me, what I've seen with comics is, growing up, I didn't like the simple art too much. I wanted a bunch of detail and all these other things. But actually, if you can pull off the same effect with a simpler image, it's actually way slicker. It's a lot more beautiful, and it's just like, the impact is just as amazing when it's done simply. And there's a lot of like where you said it was more experimental. There's one where there's a really cool panel where Vladik and Anya are leaving their village, and their path is a swastika cut out of the grass.
They don't know which way to go.
Yeah,
but all ways lead into the swastika.
Yeah,
oh my
it was
goodness.
one of the coolest. It was one of the most impactful panels I've ever seen.
Absolutely.
You just get kind of chills sometimes looking at that stuff, and that's what's so great about comics. And that was another thing is that for this time too. Keep in mind, comics in the '80s were still, they were
We're talking about John Byrne's Superman, Claremont's X-Men.
Yeah.
You know.
So you had a lot of steam, but it was still like these childlike fantasies of, power and all these other things. So something like this hits the scene. It's just like, oh man, what?
This is not a power fantasy whatsoever. You know what I'm saying? And it's very real, and it helped grow comic books up and help them be accepted more so by a mainstream audience. Maus was one of the first comic books to be taught in colleges. Whether not just about storytelling, but they were teaching this stuff in like family dynamics and stuff like psychology classes and stuff like that, because it really gets into more so the relationship between Vladek and Art than it is about Vladek's experiences in the Holocaust.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to one of my wife's cousins the other day. They came into town to visit, and I was mentioning that we were going to be, reading this and doing this video, and she was like, "I've read that."
Right.
Never read any other comic, I don't think, in her whole life, but, she's read
Most people don't even consider this a comic book,
Right.
And at the time, the term graphic novel was kind of coming into prominence.
Yeah.
And Art Spiegelman actually doesn't like the term graphic novel.
Oh, really?
He prefers it to just be a comic book. Because he's like, no, comics are legitimate. You don't have to disguise it up as a graphic novel. And a lot of people also have a problem with it because a graphic novel technically is a novel that's presented graphically, that's all original content, not a collection of things that were published before, right?
Yeah.
That's the difference technically between a trade paperback and a graphic novel.
Yeah.
But nowadays, of course, and it started with these books, Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, and Maus, like any collected comic book can also be called a graphic novel now.
Yeah.
I don't know.
See, I guess I thought earlier was in the 70s when Will Eisner started doing that, and I thought that's where the graphic novel term came from.
Well, the idea was that it would be like, what's the difference
he did,
between
like,
what I do in a novel, aside from the fact that it's graphic, meaning that it's told with pictures and images, right, and words as well. But a lot of people have a problem with this even being called a novel because they don't think that I heard this one person say it's not a novel because it's historical. I'm like, no, it can still be a novel even if it's not fiction, right?
Yeah.
Like, absolutely.
Yeah.
But anyway, if it's novel-sized, right?
Yeah.
But one of my favorite things is that he also deconstructs this metaphor, Brian, and I really do like it. And some people may think, yeah, it's silly. Why do you got to tell it with mice and cats and pigs and frogs and dogs? But I want to point you to Stan Sakai over at Usagi Yojimbo, who has told the absolute best samurai epic ever in comic books with mice and rhinos and cats, right? And it's still visceral. It's still adult. It's still meaningful. It's still textured and delicate and nuanced. And Maus is all of those things and more. And I love that he himself deconstructs the metaphor. He has that conversation with his wife where he's like, you converted to Judaism, so I don't know if I should draw you as a mouse or a frog or a moose. And then someone even asked him in the book when he's getting accosted by all the press after the success of book one, they say, if you were dealing with Israeli Jews, what would you say? Well, how would you draw them? He goes, I don't know, a porcupine?
Yeah.
Now, is he also making a statement there? They're defensive? Maybe something like that. Maybe there's nothing more to it than a cat and mouse game until he starts recognizing that in the work itself and commenting on the work. What do you think about his deconstruction of that metaphor throughout the book? I think that's one of the things that separates it from just like so many other things. It could easily be a book about Nazis and Jewish people, cats and mice, but like it goes beyond that because of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that one scene we were talking about earlier where he was, drawing, on the table and everything like that. It to me, what I like about what he was doing with deconstructing that was that he was dealing with it in the comic.
Yeah.
Too. I mean, it's like, I know they call that stuff meta now or whatever, but I mean, to me, it's like it helped explain the personal journey of creating this comic and dealing with all of these different, all these different heavy themes.
And he did release MetaMaus, which was about...
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a book called MetaMaus, and it's a bunch of images of his sketches. Oh. It's about making the book, and it comes with the DVD with some of those recordings of his father.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which you listened to some of them,
yeah,
right?
I had a CD back in the 90s that had all the tapes on there, and man, it's that's pretty heavy stuff.
It's hard. The broken English. He totally captured his father's voice in the book.
Yeah.
Like 100%.
Yeah, because the one I had, it actually, like, it was, you'd be looking at the page and you could click on the balloons and it would just, would just start reading off those sections. And yeah, there was one part that actually made me physically ill. May talk about that later, but like, I'll never forget that. Like I said, I mean, this is a comic where there's a lot that happens in here that I haven't forgotten. I mean, and I mean, when you asked me to do this, like, it took me a little bit to find my books, put it that way. I hadn't read it in probably 15, 20 years because it's not something you just, pick up and go, oh, well, I'm going to read Maus again.
I took it out of here, but when I started reading this week, I had a bookmark I had in here. So the last time I read it, I didn't even make it all the way through.
Yeah.
And the bookmark was a free donut Valentine's coupon from Krispy Kreme that expired in 2010.
Ooh.
So now I know how long it's been since I read it. But it's something that is impactful that you remember, but you don't always want to go back to it because it's very, very heavy.
Yes, it is. Yes.
And it's not just heavy because it deals with the tragedy of the Holocaust, but because it deals with the tragedy of the way his relationship with his father. And how, like, you're reading the book and you go, how could you treat your father like this after everything you went through? But we're forgetting that that wasn't part of Art's experience.
No.
The memory of it was, and that's something that he eventually became resentful for, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And he became very resentful towards a lot of the behaviors of his father. Like his father was very frugal, and he wouldn't like instead of buying toilet paper, he would go to the store, he would go to a convenience store and he would take whatever napkins he could.
Yeah.
He's like, that came from his experience in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
When you read it, he talks about the idea, like, because nobody had it easy during this time, right? On the Jewish side, right? Nobody, right? But it almost, when you're reading it, you get the sense that for some of these people, it wasn't as bad as others because he had a lot of possessions that he was able to, through great threat and danger to his own life, he was able to, like, barter a lot of his possessions for bread. But it also lets you understand the importance of things. They're giving away gold watches and diamonds for like a day's worth of bread, which for them was probably like
or if
a
they could
crust
get like a
of
bag
bread.
of sugar, then they could trade that for something.
Yes, and all, like the moment where he saves all the cigarettes up so that he can get his wife moved over to the camp next to him. That's another thing that really comes through to me really strong. Right now, as we're recording this video, my lady has been 1,600 miles away from me, and when I'm reading these bits about Anya and Vladik being separated and the pain that they feel because of it, I cannot wait till she gets back, dude. I cannot wait because it makes me so thankful for what I have. It makes me just... There are so many people in this world and throughout history that's had it so much worse than me and you.
Well, and you can contact her right now, right? I mean, you can take a break and call her instead of having to, find a sympathetic prison guard to try to pass messages at risk of her own life.
Yeah.
I mean,
right?
Like,
it's heartbreaking, dude.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's some of the most human moments of this book.
Well, he also, like, if I remember, he had to go several months without realizing whether she was even alive or not.
Yeah.
Like, I mean...
and her, too.
Because they're so separated from these things. Like, I mean, it's... Like, I can't imagine.
Now, his mother had journals that she had made and then copied over from her experiences, but her husband, Vladik, apparently burned those shortly after her suicide because it also is about dealing... Like, he's never been able to get over that.
No.
Art's never been able to get over that because he's barely even addressed it. He addressed it, like, that's why he made that prisoner in whatever,
Prisoner from Hell Planet.
Yeah, that's why he did that, was a way to kind of deal with it because he understood that he wasn't really dealing with it. So we've already been struggling and talking about, not struggling, but we've been talking about how important this book is. Mm-hmm. Why is this book so important, Brian?
To me, it's important on several levels. Its impact to the comic industry is not one of the most important ones, but it is very impactful. But to me, it was from my perspective, it was my first experience reading anything about from a survivor's standpoint from the war, which I mean, those camps, not a lot of people survived. So I mean, so it was very powerful from that. And then I've got a dad, and it's family relationships too, and that drives a lot of our lives. Yeah. And it just definitely it opens your eyes to what true tragedy and suffering really is.
Yeah, absolutely. You were talking about the importance to the comic book industry. We already talked about this. It was part of the big three. This book, Watchmen, and Dark Knight Returns. Those were the ones that really kind of grew up comic books. But the thing is, Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, they're still about superheroes.
Yeah.
This one is not. It stands out so far above and beyond those two works that I really think that if you are a comic book fan and you've never read this book, I think this is like a required reading. I think it's incredible homework to do. This is one of the most subtle, nuanced, direct, and provocative books I have ever read. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Brian. And it was also, of course, the first and only comic book to ever win the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
It won it in 1992, special prize for letters, is what they called it.
Oh, really? Oh,
which that's what their literary, they called it letters.
Okay.
I don't know, something like that. But that's high praise.
Yeah.
We always talk about how Sandman was the first and only comic to win the Hugo Sci-Fi Award?
Yeah.
And they actually changed the rules at some point so that no, they changed the rules so that it would never happen again.
Oh, wow.
Because they were comic book.
Yeah.
But of course, Sandman is an incredibly important comic book.
Yes, it is.
An incredibly relevant comic book. But Maus, I think I'm not trying to be like all up on hyperbole and all that stuff. I mean, this book's decades old.
Yeah.
Right now at this point, but like this, seriously, in my experience, people in my age range and in our age, a lot of us have read Maus, but I feel like a lot of the comic book industry and the fandom is kind of distanced from it now.
Yeah. We
don't hear as much about Maus as we used to. And when I was talking about doing this video with a lot of people at the shop, they're like, I've never read that. Oh, you won a Pulitzer Prize? What's it about? Then I tell them the simplest idea. It's about the Holocaust. The Jewish people are mice, and the Nazis are cats. They're like, oh, that's... And I'm like, no, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
So much more. Its importance cannot be understated. I mean, cannot be overstated, I should say.
Well, I mean, when you asked me to do this video, my initial reaction was like, wow, that book is really heavy. I haven't read it in a long time. And like we were saying, I don't reread this often just because it's really, it's really heavy. And, but after that initial feeling, though, I was honored that you asked me to read, to participate in this one because this one is so important.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. It
is, absolutely. So let's talk about some of the themes in the book, Brian. First of all, the obvious theme of racism.
Yeah.
There's a big theme, obviously, because it's the Nazis. They're trying to eradicate, exterminate. And that's another reason why Art Spiegelman says that he was so committed to using the mouse metaphor, is because this wasn't murder. Mm-hmm. This was extermination.
Yeah.
This isn't something you do to kill someone that you hate. This is something you do to get rid of an infestation. And that's how the Nazis painted it to the German populace at the time. It's how they painted it to themselves. It's how they justified it. And obviously it was wrong, right? And so racism is wrong, but there's also the nuance that's shown throughout it when Vladek himself is shown to be racist. Mm-hmm. Towards black people.
Yeah.
Art and his wife.
They
pick up a black hitchhiker, and he's all like disgusted by it.
See him
and it's because of an experience he had. Mm-hmm. And the big thing about this book is that it is our personal experiences that make our narrative about our worldview. Mm-hmm. Right? And so he had a bad experience, couple that with his entire bad experience. I mean, he found love, right? He had a child. Then this all happens. And the way it's portrayed in the book, Brian, it happens so slowly. It happens out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. It's like a lot of us have in our heads with these crazy historical moments like this, we can't even believe how it could even happen. Mm-hmm. It must have happened overnight and subtly, right? And suddenly. But it didn't. It happened very slowly. It happened with a bunch of small acceptances. Right? Like, okay, well, we can just move here. Mm-hmm. How many times did they do that in the book? Well, we'll just move here. We'll go to Hungary. Yeah. It'll be fine there, right? It'll be different there. We can make it through here. And then the importance on things. The importance of finding love, of having a family versus the importance of surviving. Because how many moments in the story does Vladek come across as very, very selfish? He survives at certain points. Remember in the part where they're in the they're in the trains, and he makes himself like a hammock, so he can stand above everybody else.
So he won't get pressed in.
Yeah, and it's like survival. This book is so much about survival, and in these crazy times, you lose your humanity sometimes to survive. And how can you how do you even go beyond that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like, he was portrayed as probably one of the most resourceful people I've ever read about in the history of mankind. You know, because like with that love and family, you know, early on, you know, he got a good career out of it. And so he was able to they were able to start off with some possessions, so they were able to trade for some things. And he took that, I mean, throughout this entire thing. Like, I mean, there's, you know, you're watching all these tragedies unfold, like, you know, when they create the ghettos and they're stuck in the ghettos and then keep going, but he's able to keep wheeling and dealing, you know, for lack of a better way to put it. Because like when he was in the train, since he was up, he was like, you know, he was eating snow, but like then he was still managing to trade stuff while they were still on the train.
Yeah, and people are begging him for some of that snow. Yeah, and it's a painful
so he's trading
moment.
Snow for sugar just to have a little bit there, and then people, you know, it's
because the other people were eating all the sugar that they had, but they didn't have any water, and it was
burning their throats and everything like that. It was just
it's really rough. Really rough. Another theme for me, Brian, is about the dysfunctional family, the relationship of the father and the son, and the fact that, like I said, it's painful to see the way that Art he treats his father, I think, kindly, right? Yeah. But he has no patience with his father. Mm-hmm. It's like on this mission to understand what his father went through, he still is oblivious to understand his father, you know, and his father doesn't understand his son. Right. Right. And so that this dysfunctional family idea, and like, I think every family in America is dysfunctional in some way or another, you know, to have, first of all, so there's another son. Art was not the firstborn, but their firstborn son was actually poisoned by one of his aunts to stop him from going into the concentration camp.
Yeah, they were about to get captured.
And there's a moment in the book where he talks about how his older brother's picture was always on the mantle, and he was the perfect child because he couldn't age. Yeah, he was always this idea of what they had, and he always felt like he had to compete against that, and the resentment that comes from that, the resentment that he came from his father telling him, you got it so easy, you've never worked for anything in your life, you don't understand how lucky you are, and the resentment he has from, you know, about that he's found happiness in life. He's found success in life. And he sees his father has never recovered. He's recovered. His father recovered from the Holocaust, but he could never recover from his wife's death.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. 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 That's, that's definitely a key point in the book. And it's just, because there's one scene I do remember where his new wife, Mala, did something. I can't remember. And he just, all he's talking about is his first wife, you know, and just like, you know, it's just. And
she mentions that he has all these pictures of her. It's like a shrine. Yeah. He's like, but I got one picture of you up there too. Yeah. You know, and it's like, absolutely. But like, that's a true, look what they went through together. Yeah. You know? And to me, another thing about this is real big is memory. Whereas Carl Sagan would say, the persistence of memory, for all my Cosmos fans, apparently that's the I don't know. Apparently that's the Cosmos sign.
I didn't know that one.
No, this is Wakanda. This is Cosmos.
That's Wakanda.
Cosmos. Okay. Wakanda goes like this.
Yeah.
Right over left.
Is it?
Yep, it's right over left. Very important.
Okay.
It's based on the Egyptian stuff.
I didn't
symbolism.
Know that.
Anyway, talking about symbolism and all that stuff. So the persistence of memory, meaning that like the memory that his father has of his times struggling to survive in Poland, in Germany, in Hungary. Mm-hmm. They never actually made it to Hungary, did they?
No, that was how they got captured.
Yeah, because they got
betrayed when they paid that guy to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And so the memory, not just that Vladek has, that how that affects his life, but how his father's memory, how the past never lets go. Yeah. And we mentioned this before, but like unto the fourth generation, right? Yeah. Like it stays there. Art's life is defined by his father and his mother's experience in the Holocaust during World War II, right?
Yeah, and that's where like where he's struggling with these things is, you know, basically a lot of times Vladek is trying to get him to live with him, you know, and take care of him, and you know, that's a lot of, you know, it seems to be a lot of things from, you know, from that generation where, you know, you take care of your parents in their older years, and I think, you know, you can see the guilt in him there, but he's like, you know, he's still refusing to do it. Like they go save him, or they go to him one time because he's had a heart attack or something like that, and he's fine. You know, he's just walking around. He just wanted him to come visit him at his cabin, and that was where one of the frugal scenes that I liked is that Francois pointed out that the gas was paid for in the place, and so he just left the burner on so he wouldn't have to use matches.
Yeah. And he gives them crap about the matches.
Yeah.
But then he says, and at one point when they're talking about the train, he mentions that they were stacked up like matches in a matchbox.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And like the way that works with these, like, dude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
It was great.
It rips you, like, because at times you're like, I understand exactly what Art is saying.
Yeah.
And then something like that happens and you're like, I feel like a terrible person.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah.
And imagine how Art Spiegelman felt making this book.
Yeah.
And then making money and success off of this book.
Yeah.
And that's another thing is the guilt.
Yeah.
The guilt of being a survivor. Not just being a survivor, but being the son of a survivor.
Yeah.
My life was never as hard as my father's. So I'm always going to feel guilty about this. I'm always going to feel put down, especially when my father makes sure that I feel that way and that I understand.
Yeah. It didn't, I guess there's part of me that, like, I know he felt guilty about the success of this, but, like, to me, I didn't read this thinking that he did this to make a bunch of money.
He didn't.
He did it to tell a story, to help resolve his own feelings. And honestly, like, in certain scenes, like what we're just talking about, like, it doesn't come out great, right? I mean, to me, that takes a lot of courage to so accurately portray something like that. I mean, that's not something that's easy for hardly anybody to do.
Another thing that made this stand out so much, aside from other literary works that were comic book and sequential art, is that how personal it was.
Yeah.
And people say it's hard to have an objective point on this story, especially when you use the animal metaphor. But Art Spiegelman says, I wasn't trying to be objective.
Oh, no.
This point of the story is not to have an objective look on Jewish survival in the Holocaust, but to explain and figure out my own experiences with my family and our past.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And how that history comes back, and it's haunting. That's one of my favorite things about the movie The Shining, the movie version, right? To me, that movie, everybody always argues about what it's actually about. It's about history. It's about the past, and how the past haunts us, even if we feel like we're so far removed from it. People today like to say, in America, that because it's something like, how can we even understand what it's like for a nation to go through something like this, right? For a country. Well, the Civil War, slavery here in America, right? And sometimes it's easy to feel like we're so far removed from that, that it's not our issue anymore. It's not our problem. But history, the past, is haunting. It doesn't let go. We're still dealing with struggles from that. And that's why I think this book is still incredibly relevant today. Because it's about the guilt. It's about the survival. It's about the guilt of having a better life than the generations before us. It's about feeling like we know better than they did. They may have had it worse, but we know better now. And I love the moments where he's talking about, well, I heard that, why didn't y'all fight back?
Yeah.
And his father's like, you don't understand. And they point, I really feel like in the book, after you read it, you understand how this can happen. And how you can accept it, and how you can completely be zapped of all willpower and humanity that you don't even try to fight back. Yeah. And especially when you see people try to, and they just get taken out immediately.
Yeah, because they definitely dealt with that directly.
And that doesn't, what good does that do? You know? It's got elements of Stalag 17 in there with the POW camps. I love that movie, the Billy Wilder movie. You ever seen that, Stalag 17? It's a great comedy about prisoners of war in World War II. Oh. You should totally watch it, man. It's absolutely brilliant. It's really, really good. Okay. But it's humorous, but it really captures a tone that MAUS kind of does. I don't think it's near as delicate as MAUS is. But I would definitely encourage you to read it, to watch it. Because even MAUS, the book, is humorous in parts. Yeah,
that's... I was gonna bring that up. But there is a scene in there where, like, I laugh every single time I read it. It's he's visiting his dad, and as he's about to go out, like he can't find his coat, and so he asks Mala, and she doesn't know where it's at, and so he goes and asks his dad, and his dad's thrown it away, and the trash has actually been picked up.
Yeah,
and he's like, "But you can have this one. This is my old coat. I bought me a new one. You can have this one." And it's a Naga hide windbreaker, and it's just I don't know. I bust out laughing
in
every
like
single
1978,
time. And it shows him that he looks all puffed out and everything like that, and he's just like.
And then I love it because the next time he visits his father, he's got his own coat, a brand new trench coat. They point it out, and then at one point, I can't remember what it is, but he says, "At least you didn't throw it out," or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So I really, really like it. Any other themes you can pick up or anything you want to elaborate on, Brian?
Not that I can. Well, I mean, I guess I know we talked about the animal metaphors and things like that, but the symbolism of those times also, I think, drove a lot of those things. Because the Nazis are really big on symbols. And they do carry a lot of weight and power, and that's why they were attacking the Mickey Mouse and the Disney thing, because they were attacking the symbol. Because the end of that quote says something like proudly wear your swastika.
Yes. Our symbol over theirs.
Yeah, and I've always found that to be an integral part of those stories, and the family stuff is just so. I haven't gone through certain things like that, or everything, but I still felt the power of those scenes, of the things he was describing, and I guess just like I said earlier, where he's like the most resourceful, one of the most resourceful people I've ever read about, is just the sheer act of survival. We have lots of different tales of survival and everything like that, but there's very few that are as powerful as this. The part that where I got physically ill was he caught typhus in Dachau, and when I first read this, I didn't know what typhus was. We don't have it here. It just doesn't happen. It probably does. But it makes you have to go to the bathroom pretty violently, and where he was at, to get to the bathroom, he had to walk over people. Yeah. And they weren't all alive. And and that was also one on the CD that I made the mistake and clicked the dialogue and listened to his dad describe it, and it's something I'll never forget. This is a powerful story of survival, but at the same time, you're reading it and you're like, millions of people didn't do that. Millions of people did not make it through.
And they make a good point in the book of showing that. Yeah. Because pretty much Vladek and Anya were like almost the only people in that family that made it through.
I think they have one relative, I want to say, that made it over to the States.
Yeah, like a cousin or something like that. Yeah.
And they had big families. You can see that in the beginning. When they're sitting there at dinner, there's 20 people at the table.
It's heartbreaking, especially the moments when they get fooled. Yeah. By the Nazis and by Polish people that are trying to help them, maybe, and betraying them, and then showing that, even as compassionate as some of the people that helped them were, when it came down to the question of survival, us versus them, sorry. Yeah. You got to go. You got to get out of here right now. Mm-hmm. And the guilt that you feel over that. I absolutely love this book. I think it's exceptional. I think it is necessary for any comic book fan to read this book to understand the power of the medium and what we can actually do with comic books. But I also think it's important for any American, for any European, for anybody on this planet to read it, because it's a great story about not just survival, but about how easily something like the Holocaust can happen. Yeah. And how it gets it could happen again. Well, and it does.
There are rising tides of these happening again. And I recently watched a documentary, and it opened with a quote from Hegel, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it basically said, what we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. Yeah. And that really struck a chord with me, and this easily can happen again. There are pockets in the world where it's currently happening. Yeah. Yemen. But yeah, it's very important, and not just comic fans should be reading this. Everybody. I think it's one of the most powerful pieces of literature out there.
Absolutely. It's why it won a Pulitzer Prize. This is the book I have right here. Brian has it in the 2 volumes that it came in, book 1, book 2. My Father Bleeds History, and Here My Troubles Began.
Yeah, and can I point out one more thing?
Yeah, please do.
His dad doesn't say, Here My Troubles Begin, until 1944 when he's in Auschwitz. Yeah. That's where he says his troubles began. When he went through the ghettos, the pogroms, all through this entire journey. And that's where I found that.
Yeah, and maybe part of that was his separation from his wife.
That's true.
From
the
love of his life. So
where that started.
We're going to throw links down below to get the complete mouse and each individual books. And heck yeah, we'll even throw MetaMaus down there because it's a really cool exploration of the book and the process. Art Spiegelman, Very important to the industry. A lot of people may not know him because he's never did a run on Deadpool, never did an X-Men run or anything like that. But still, some of the most important comic books out there. So we'll throw links down below so you can read them, check them out for yourself, and help support PCP all at the same time. Brian, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you.
This has been great.
Yeah.
I really feel like this tiny little internet show about past comics has finally grown up.
Yeah.
And of course, we're at the end of season 1. So 20 episodes of Comics Revisited, a lot of Venom, a little of Infinity Gauntlet, a little bit of Warren Ellis Stormwatch in there, some other things, some what ifs. And we end with a bang with one of the most important comic books ever, Maus. But have no fear, season 2 of Comics Revisited is coming in June of this year. And you'll get to see things like, we're going to be talking about The Watchmen. We're going to be talking about Sandman. We're going to do our first Grant Morrison comic book. We're covering Zenith.
Oh.
And one more thing I'm going to throw out there. We're covering our first Vault comic book on Comics Revisited, and it's going to be Friendo.
Oh.
And I'm very excited to do that because I've completed Friendo now, and it's so awesome. I can't wait till you check it out.
Yeah, I will be checking that out.
So good. So anyway, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate Brian being here. Like we said, check out Maus. Go to your local comic shop. If they don't carry it, ask for it. Tell them, demand that they carry it. Every comic shop, every bookstore should carry this book, in my opinion. Absolutely.
Totally agree.
So, I've been Rockin' Robbie Billups. This has been
Brian Weaver.
Please do like, share, and subscribe, and join us at Pop Culture Philosophers for podcasts and a whole lot more. And like I said, Comics Revisited Season 2. Brian's going to be back. I'm going to be back. Brooks, Jelani, and a whole bunch of others. We're very, very excited. We are Pop Culture Philosophers. Thanks for rocking with us. Umbrellas.